Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategic Labs, the channel where we deeply analyze the ideas, narratives, and strategies behind the documents. We are Sarah and Mark. Today, we are going to dive into the material we have on the table. Before we start, please leave a like, share the episode, subscribe to the channel, and remember to check the description for the links to access the original material.
So if I asked you to imagine trying to outmaneuver, the CIA, MI6, or the KGB at the very height of the Cold War, what comes to mind?
I mean, definitely stealth bombers, right?
Yeah.
Or launching massive surveillance satellites, just armies of spies.
Exactly. For most state actors, doing that without a standing army sounds completely impossible.
Yeah, completely.
But when you actually look at the geopolitical history of the last few centuries, well, one institution has consistently done exactly that.
And that is exactly what we are getting into in today's analysis. We're looking at excerpts from Edward H. Whitmore's book, Shadow Intelligence Series, Vatican, The Holy See, Global Networks, and How Influence Shapes Power, Presence, and Strategy.
It's quite a title, but it's a fascinating deep dive.
It really is, because the mission of our analysis today is to completely tear down that Hollywood myth, of what intelligence gathering actually is. We're looking at a system that survives entirely on this invisible planetary web of human relationships.
Right. And it forces a total recalibration of how you, as a listener and an observer of global politics, actually measure power.
Because we're so culturally conditioned to equate intelligence with, well, aggression.
Yeah, precisely. The standard state actor model, whether you're talking about the Mossad, the CIA, or China's MSS, it relies on forced entry.
Right, you bribe a foreign official, or you hack a secure server.
Or you fly a drone over restricted airspace.
Yeah.
I mean, it operates like a sledgehammer trying to just smash down a door.
Or like a blinding spotlight trying to force all the secrets out of the dark.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
But Whitmore's analysis posits a completely different framework. He calls it intelligence without armies.
Intelligence without armies. I kept trying to find a visual for this while going through the documents.
What did you come up with?
Well, what kept coming to mind wasn't a military command center at all. It was actually a forest.
Okay, a forest. Walk me through that.
Specifically, I kept thinking about the mycelial network underneath a forest floor. Fungi.
Oh, right.
Because when you think about conventional intelligence, it's like an invasive species. It just drops in from the outside.
Right. Doesn't belong there naturally.
Exactly. But a mycelial network, it's already deeply embedded in the soil. It's naturally integrated into the roots of the trees.
So it doesn't have to force its way in.
Right. It doesn't have to hack into the ecosystem to know what's happening. It literally senses every drop of rain, every shift in soil acidity, every dying root, simply because it is physically present everywhere.
I love that biological analogy because it captures the mechanics perfectly. I mean, a state intelligence agent has to artificially insert themselves into a foreign environment, right?
Yeah, and scramble to build some fake cover story.
Exactly. The Holy See doesn't need to build cover. The church already operates in over 180 countries.
Which is a staggering footprint.
It really is.
Yep.
But more importantly, consider how they operate. They don't just have, fortified embassies in capital cities behind huge walls.
Right. They possess this living, organic infrastructure.
Yeah. Parishes, schools, hospitals, charities, refugee centers, they are baked into the daily mundane existence of billions of people.
Which means the intelligence isn't being gathered by spies looking for state secrets in manila envelopes.
No, not at all.
It's being gathered by people administering vaccines, teaching children, and just listening to the daily grievances of the working class.
And that massive footprint is the first pillar of their strategy, which the text identifies as presence.
Right. But presence alone is just passive observation, isn't it?
It is. So, to actually weaponize that presence, to get inside the geopolitical rooms that are completely locked to secular intelligence agencies, you need the second pillar.
Which is diplomacy, but a very specific kind of diplomacy, right?
Exactly. Think about the fundamental limitation of a secular diplomat. If you are an American ambassador sitting in a room with a hostile foreign power, every single word you say is run through a filter of geopolitical calculus.
Right, because the host country assumes, correctly I might add, that you are just there to advance your nation's economic and military interests.
You're there for the oil, or the trade routes, or the military bases.
Yeah.
But a Vatican diplomat, an apostolic nuncio, walks into that exact same room with a dual mandate.
Right, yes, they represent a sovereign state, but they are also a spiritual emissary.
Exactly. They carry this baseline of moral and religious legitimacy that fundamentally alters the whole psychological dynamic of the negotiation.
It essentially acts as a skeleton key.
That's exactly what it is.
They can bypass the immediate political hostility because, like you said, they aren't competing for land or oil.
And that unique access leads to the ultimate goal, which is the third pillar, influence.
Because knowing a revolution is about to happen is totally useless if you can't intervene.
Right. The Vatican takes this localized data, combines it with that top-tier diplomatic access, and operationalizes it to shift policies in immediate conflicts.
But I think to really grasp how they built this mycelial network, we have to recognize that this wasn't always their strategy.
Capital.
They didn't just choose soft power out of sheer benevolence. They were kind of backed into a corner, weren't they?
Yeah, this is a crucial piece of historical context that you really have to keep in mind. For centuries, the Pope was literally a king with armies.
Right, controlling vast swaths of the Italian peninsula, the Papal States.
Exactly. They fought wars, they projected hard military power, just like any other European kingdom.
So what changed?
Well, the massive structural pivot happened in the 19th century. By around 1870, the unification of Italy basically stripped the Vatican of its physical territory.
Wow.
Yeah, they lost their armies and their material wealth. They were suddenly reduced to just a few acres of buildings in Rome.
So it was a literal adapt or die moment.
Complete.
Because when you lose the ability to project physical violence or defend your borders with troops, your survival suddenly hinges entirely on information.
Right. They couldn't outgun anyone anymore.
So they had to outthink, outlisten, and outweight everyone else.
It's ironic, actually. Their greatest historical vulnerability, losing their empire, forced them to perfect this invisible informational empire.
But managing an informational empire requires a staggering administrative apparatus to function.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if you are operating a mycelial network that spans the globe, generating tens of thousands of data points daily, from the geopolitical maneuvering of a nuncio in Paris to the economic struggles observed by a parish priest in Manila, how do you physically process that?
Because information gathering is useless without synthesis.
Right. So let's actually look at the physical and bureaucratic mechanics of that synthesis. Because all of this data eventually flows to the central nervous system located in Rome.
And the very top of that nervous system is the papal office.
Right. And Whitmore's analysis really shatters the common perception of the Pope, like as merely a pastoral figurehead kissing babies from a balcony.
Yeah, from a strategic standpoint, the Pope is the ultimate arbiter of the largest human intelligence flow on the planet.
But the Pope isn't sitting at a desk all day reading raw translated letters from rural parishes, is he?
No, of course not. The engine that actually drives this, the machine stamping the documents and doing all the heavy cross-referencing, is the Roman Curia.
And the Curia often gets dismissed by outside observers, right? They see it as this archaic, slow-moving religious bureaucracy.
They do, but if you look closer at its architecture, it's brilliant. Within the Curia, the most critical node for global intelligence is the Secretariat of State.
Okay, the Secretariat of State, how is that structured?
Well, this office is specifically divided to handle the dual nature of Vatican operations. You have the section for general affairs, which basically manages the internal governance.
So the daily operations of the global church, personnel, internal logistics, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And then you have the section for relations with states, which acts essentially as their foreign ministry.
And I imagine those two sections are in constant dialogue.
Oh, nonstop.
Yeah.
Imagine a piece of information originating in, say, a rural village in El Salvador.
Okay.
It doesn't just get emailed directly to the Pope. It has to survive this rigorous filtering mechanism designed to strip away noise.
So what does that path look like?
Well, the local priest reports a disturbing trend to his regional bishop.
Right.
The bishop collates that with other local reports and brings it to the apostolic nuncio, who, remember, is the macro-level diplomat for that country.
Right, the ambassador.
Yeah. Then the nuncio takes that grassroots data, synthesizes it with whatever political intelligence they've gathered from the capital, and sends a secure diplomatic cable to the Secretariat of State back in Rome.
Okay, so once it hits Rome, I'm assuming the analysts in the Secretariat don't just take it at face value.
Not at all. This is where the vetting process gets really fascinating. They take that cable from El Salvador and cross-reference it against reports from neighboring countries.
Makes sense?
They check it against historical precedents from their massive archives. And through all of this, the institution enforces what the text calls a strict preference for tentative language.
Tentative language, so they despise rapid, reactive conclusion.
Exactly. If a secular agency gets a tip about an uprising, They might escalate to DEFCON 3 in an hour. The Vatican prefers to observe, wait, and verify.
Okay, but wait, let me pause right here and look at this logically.
Sure.
Because if I'm a secular intelligence director and you tell me your primary data collection relies on tens of thousands of local parish priests, I'm going to laugh you out of the room.
Why is that?
Because a local priest is deeply embedded in his community. He has personal biases, theological biases, and cultural blind spots. How does a priest separate his own emotional entanglement from objective geopolitical reality? It just feels like the entire data collection process is structurally flawed by massive human bias.
And if you judge the Vatican by the metrics of the CIA, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Because a secular agency wants cold, quantitative data, right? Troop movements, satellite imagery of missile silos, economic inflation rates.
Yeah, hard numbers. Subjective emotion is considered noise.
Exactly. But the Vatican's entire apparatus is built on the realization that this so-called noise is actually the most predictive data you can gather.
Wait, really?
Yes, they don't view the priest's bias as a bug in the system. They view it as a feature.
Wait, because if you're the Vatican, you actually want to know that a priest is terrified or angry.
Exactly.
Because if the priest feels that way, it means his congregation feels that way. So you aren't just mapping the physical terrain, you're mapping the emotional terrain.
Precisely. Think about it. A satellite image can tell you that a military convoy is moving down a highway, right? But it cannot tell you that the civilian population in the neighboring town has completely lost faith in their government and is mentally preparing for a civil war.
Oh, wow. That's a huge blind spot for secular agencies.
Massive. So when Rome receives a highly emotional, subjective report from a priest, they use that multi-layered filtering process in the Secretariat of State to strip away the unhelpful personal bias while extracting the vital human context.
So they are actively measuring the social temperature.
Exactly. They want to know the mood of the populace because major geopolitical earthquakes always start as imperceptible social tremors.
Okay, that completely reframes how we look at the actual operatives on the ground.
It does.
Let's dig into the specific logistics of this dual network a bit more. We have the macro level, the diplomats, and the micro level, the grassroots clergy. Let's start with the macro, the apostolic nuncios.
Right.
We mentioned their dual mandate earlier, but how does that actually play out in a crisis?
Well, consider the legal protections involved. A nuncio holds diplomatic immunity under international law. That means their communications are secure, their residences are inviolable, and they have the legal right to freely traverse a host country.
Standard ambassador stuff.
Right. But because they are also high-ranking archbishops, they possess deep ecclesiastical authority.
So imagine the logistical advantage here. In the morning, a nuncio can walk through the front doors of a presidential palace using their diplomatic credentials to sit down with the dictator and discuss state policy.
Exactly.
But that evening, they can quietly walk into a basement meeting with local bishops or even underground political dissidents, using their religious authority to gather completely unfiltered human intelligence.
And secular diplomats absolutely cannot do that.
No, if an American ambassador starts holding secret meetings with dissidents in a basement, they get expelled for espionage immediately.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The host nation tolerates the nuncio's domestic meddling because to expel a papal representative isn't just a political spat.
Right. It risks alienating the entire Catholic population of that country.
Exactly. So the nuncio operates in this protected liminal space. They gather the high-altitude political intelligence from the ruling class and fuse it with the ground-level reality provided by the micro-network, the local parishes.
And the parish priest is perhaps the most brilliant, intuitive intelligence asset ever devised.
I would argue they are.
I mean, think about the daily mechanics of a priest's life. They aren't sitting in an office looking at spreadsheets.
No.
They are in the hospitals, they are conducting weddings and funerals, and crucially, they are administering the sacrament of confession.
That's the key right there. They are woven into the deepest, most vulnerable parts of the human experience.
Yeah.
A citizen will confess fears, economic anxieties, and social frustrations to a priest that they would never, ever articulate to a government pollster or a state official.
To see how devastatingly effective this micro-level intelligence is, let's actually look at the specific historical evidence from the documents.
Good idea.
Take Central America during the mid to late 20th century. You had extreme political repression, military juntas, and brewing Marxist revolution.
Okay, a very volatile time.
And foreign governments, relying on secular intelligence, were almost entirely blind to what was happening in the rural jungles and impoverished highlands.
Because they were only talking to the elites in the capital cities.
Exactly. But local parish priests were actually living in those highlands. They were witnessing the land disputes firsthand.
They saw the early, quiet mobilization of peasant movements.
Yeah, and they were burying the victims of the initial undocumented military crackdowns. They felt the revolutionary tension years before the first shots of civil war were fired.
And what did they do with that information? They didn't have encrypted smartphones?
No, they wrote letters, they held synods, they passed verbal messages to their regional bishops.
Who fed it to the nuncios, who then cabled Rome.
Exactly. So the Secretariat of State had a granular, high-definition picture of the impending social collapse long before Washington or Moscow truly understood the scale of the unrest.
And this allowed the Vatican to preemptively position its diplomacy.
Right, sometimes shielding dissidents, sometimes establishing back-channel dialogues between guerrillas and the state.
There is another really profound example of this localized sensory network in the text, and it occurred during the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1980s.
Right, that's a really compelling case study.
When the virus first emerged, secular state governments were basically paralyzed.
There was massive political hesitation.
Yeah, denial, and a tendency to treat it purely as an isolated clinical anomaly. Intelligence agencies weren't looking at it because, well, it wasn't a military threat.
But Catholic health workers and local priests were the ones holding the hands of dying in the hospices.
Exactly. They immediately detected that this wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a rapidly expanding social catastrophe.
They saw the severe stigmatization, the destruction of local communities, and the absolute failure of state support systems.
And the grassroots data flowed upward rapidly. It informed the Vatican that a profound human crisis was unfolding.
Which consequently allowed the Holy See to shape its global pastoral response, its resource allocation for hospitals, and its public health messaging with a real awareness of the human suffering involved.
Bypassing the political gridlock that stalled so many secular governments.
It's the mycelial network in action right there. The roots sense the poison in the soil before the tree's leaves start to wither.
Exactly.
But here is the most crucial takeaway for anyone trying to understand the mechanics of this power. The information flow is not a one-way street.
No, it can't be. Gathering intelligence merely for the sake of knowing is a purely academic exercise. For the Vatican, intelligence is a prerequisite for action. The flow is entirely bidirectional.
Right. Rome takes this massive deluge of global data, analyzes it, and formulates a grand strategy. But how did they deploy it without an army?
They push the influence back down the exact same network.
So Rome issues an encyclical or a pastoral letter or a direct strategic mandate to the bishops.
Right. And then those local priests take those high-level geopolitical directives and translate them into Sunday sermons, community outreach programs, and local voting advice.
Wow. They are actively molding the cultural and political environment of their local communities based on a unified, intelligence-driven strategy formulated thousands of miles away.
The grassroots informs the grand strategy, and the grand strategy reshapes the grassroots. It is a continuous, self-sustaining feedback loop.
That is the purest definition of soft power.
It really is.
Now, managing a network this complex requires incredible intellectual firepower. You can't just rely on pious intuition, right?
Right, definitely not.
You need operators who can analyze Marxist economic theory, untangle complex geopolitical alliances, and bridge the massive gap between theology and modern statecraft.
And to understand how the Vatican does this, we have to look at their intellectual vanguard, the Jesuits.
The Society of Jesus.
Right. To really understand their utility in the realm of intelligence, you have to look at the specific historical trauma that birthed them. They were founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola.
During a very chaotic time for the church.
Exactly. The Catholic Church was hemorrhaging power and territory due to the Protestant Reformation. It was an existential crisis. The old methods of control were just failing.
And Loyola wasn't a theologian by trade, was he? He was a Basque military officer whose leg was shattered by a cannonball.
Right. So when he designed this new order, he didn't design them to be cloistered monks chanting in a remote abbey. He designed them as the intellectual shock troops of the Counter-Reformation.
They were built for mobility.
Exactly. They were commanded to go out into the secular world, master the sciences, master the arts, and win back cultural influence through intellect and persuasion rather than the sword.
And Over the centuries, that mandate evolved into a highly specialized function. Whitmore's analysis makes a really compelling case that the Jesuits function as an informal, decentralized, yet fiercely elite intelligence agency for the Holy See.
If the local parish priests are the field agents gathering human intelligence, the Jesuits are the elite intelligence think tank.
Consider their footprint. They operate globally recognized universities, the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., Sophia University in Tokyo.
And operating these universities serves multiple strategic functions simultaneously.
Right.
First, it places them at the bleeding edge of global thought. By deeply engaging with academia, secular philosophy, and political theory, they gather massive amounts of intellectual intelligence.
So they know where the culture is shifting before the culture itself knows.
Exactly. But secondly, and far more importantly for long-term influence, they are literally educating the next generation of secular leaders.
It's a brilliant long-tail strategy. You bring the future prime ministers, diplomats, and intelligence directors of secular nations into your universities, and you embed your ethical frameworks, your philosophical worldview into their foundational education.
You are shaping the minds that will eventually run the states you have to negotiate with.
Yeah, but they aren't just academics. They have a long history of operational intelligence, too. Let's look at their role during the Cold War.
Oh, this is fascinating. Operating behind the Iron Curtain was arguably the most dangerous intelligence theater of the 20th century.
Right. Traditional Western spies faced immense logistical hurdles.
Yeah, lack of cover, language barriers, and highly effective Soviet counterespionage. But Jesuit priests operated clandestinely within the Eastern Bloc for decades.
How did they manage that?
Well, they blended in. Because they are scholars, they could integrate into the academic and cultural fabric of the communist regimes.
Oh, wow.
They were quietly monitoring the survival of the underground church, tracking the subtle ideological shifts among the Soviet youth, and analyzing the fragility of the political system.
So they provided the Secretariat of State with a deeply nuanced sociological understanding of the Soviet reality.
Exactly. While the CIA was counting tanks and estimating nuclear stockpiles, the Jesuits were evaluating the spiritual and cultural exhaustion of the Soviet citizen.
And beyond gathering data, their deep cultural and linguistic mastery makes them unparalleled back-channel diplomats.
Right.
Like, when a conflict reaches a deadlock and secular diplomats refuse to speak to each other out of national pride, the Jesuits can often slip through the cracks.
Because they are scholars who immerse themselves in the history of the regions where they operate. They understand the philosophical underpinnings of the conflict.
So they provide a neutral, deeply informed space for mediation.
They blend theological rigor with geopolitical strategy to create what the Tekla calls a living intelligence mosaic.
A living intelligence mosaic. But, as dynamic and living as the Jesuits and the nuncios are, there's another component to the Vatican's intelligence apparatus that is distinctly non-dynamic.
Very true.
It is incredibly static, intensely guarded, and relies on the sheer weight of history. I'm talking about the Vatican Apostolic Archive.
The secret archives. It's practically a trope in historical thrillers.
Right. But the reality detailed in the analysis is far more strategic and, frankly, more fascinating than the fiction.
Let's just establish the physical reality of what we are talking about here. We are talking about over 85 kilometers of shelving.
That is over 50 miles of dense physical documents.
Spanning 12 centuries. We are talking about original papal bulls, records of inquisitions, centuries of diplomatic correspondence.
Treaties that divided the New World, the intimate letters of kings and queens.
It is the ultimate institutional memory. And in the context of global intelligence, the Vatican treats historical knowledge as an active, deployable weapon.
To understand this, you have to consider the temporal difference between a secular state and the Holy See.
Right. Secular governments, particularly democracies, are trapped in short-term thinking.
A president or a prime minister is operating on a 4 to 5 year election cycle.
Exactly. Their intelligence agencies are constantly pressured by the executive branch to deliver immediate tactical wins to support short-term domestic policy or secure re-election.
But the Vatican does not have elections. It does not have term limits. It operates on multi-generational, even century-long timelines.
They are not plotting for the next 4 years. They are plotting for the next 100.
And when you operate on that scale, historical precedent isn't just trivia, it is vital intelligence.
Exactly. When a territorial dispute flares up in South America today, Vatican analysts don't just look at current satellite data.
No, they can walk into the archives, pull the diplomatic correspondence from 300 years ago when those borders were first drawn by Catholic missionaries.
And understand the deep generational grievances driving the current conflict.
And this gives them the strategic advantage of selective disclosure.
Which is incredibly powerful.
The Vatican strictly controls who gets to walk into those archives and what they are allowed to see. By keeping this massive vault locked and only releasing specific historical documents at precise, calculated moments, they can intervene in modern conflicts.
Right. They can release a document that affirms one nation's territorial claim over another, or they can release historical records to defend their own institutional legitimacy against a modern political attack.
But here's where I struggle with this strategy.
Okay, what's the issue?
If their goal is influence and moral authority, doesn't this obsession with secrecy actively harm them?
In what way?
I mean, by hoarding 50 miles of history behind locked doors and playing games with selective disclosure, aren't they just feeding the massive ecosystem of conspiracy theories?
I see your point.
They look like they are hiding something sinister. It seems like a massive PR failure.
Well, it's a very modern critique, assuming that transparency is always an absolute good. But let's look at the Vatican's defensive logic here.
Oh, okay.
They accept that the secrecy breeds conspiracy theories. They view the Da Vinci Code-style rumors as a completely acceptable minor tax to pay for the preservation of institutional continuity.
Wait, why? How is secrecy preserving continuity?
Because in our hyper-reactive, politically polarized world, overt transparency is easily weaponized.
Oh, I see.
Imagine if the Vatican digitized the entire 85 kilometers of archives and put it on the open internet tomorrow.
It would be chaos.
Absolute chaos. Decontextualized historical documents, letters from the 14th century, rough drafts of controversial treaties would be immediately seized upon by political adversaries, hostile state actors, and rival ideological factions.
They would be used to attack the church, undermine its modern diplomatic efforts, and generate endless manufactured controversies.
Exactly.
So the archive isn't just a vault, it's a blast shield.
Precisely. It is a defense mechanism against the weaponization of history. By maintaining strict, unapologetic gatekeeping, the Vatican ensures that it dictates the narrative on its own timeline.
It prevents its long-term strategic posture from being derailed by short-term political outrage.
They understand that knowledge is only power if you retain absolute control over how, when, and to whom that knowledge is deployed.
It's literally treating history as classified intel.
Exactly.
So let's pull all of these threads together. The nuncios, the grassroots parishes, the Jesuit think tanks, and the weaponized archives. How does this massive, slow-moving apparatus actually execute soft power on the global stage?
Whitmore provides two massive historical climaxes to prove this system works. Let's really dig into the first one. The Cold War in Poland in 1979.
Okay, the election of Pope John Paul II and his subsequent visit to his native Poland. It is arguably the greatest masterclass in intelligence-driven soft power in the 20th century.
Without a doubt.
To the average television viewer in 1979, it just looked like a beautiful, purely spiritual homecoming. The Pope kissing the ground of his homeland.
Right. But the logistics and the strategy behind that trip were breathtaking.
The Vatican didn't just guess that the time was right, did they?
No, they had been receiving a constant, granular stream of intelligence from local Polish priests for years. They knew exactly how deep the economic frustration ran.
They knew the nascent solidarity movement, the labor union fighting the communists, was gaining incredible underground momentum.
The Kremlin had tanks, secret police, and absolute control of the media.
Yeah.
But the Vatican's intelligence apparatus realized a critical flaw in the Soviet armor.
Which was?
The communist regime in Poland was highly vulnerable to a unified moral and cultural awakening. They couldn't arrest the Pope. They couldn't shoot 1 million Polish citizens gathering for a mass.
Wow. So the intelligence provided the insight, the society is ready to fracture.
Yes.
And John Paul II provided the influence. He didn't tell them to take up arms. He simply told them, be not afraid.
He utilized the exact emotional and cultural intelligence gathered by the mycelial network to deliver a message that galvanized the working class.
It provided the moral cover for the solidarity movement to push forward, which eventually served as the catalyst for the collapse of the entire Soviet bloc.
The CIA spent billions trying to crack the Soviet Union. The Vatican helped do it with local priests and a pastoral visit.
That is incredible. And the second historical climax detailed in the analysis highlights their back-channel diplomatic capabilities, the mediation between the United States and Cuba.
Right. This was a conflict frozen in absolute hostility for over 50 years.
Yeah.
Traditional diplomacy was a complete dead end.
Yeah, an American politician couldn't be seen negotiating with the Castros without committing political suicide in Florida.
And the Cuban regime couldn't bow to American pressure without losing its revolutionary legitimacy.
But the Vatican possessed the infrastructure to bypass the political gridlock entirely.
They utilized their Jesuit networks, who maintained a highly respected intellectual and social presence in both Washington, D.C. and Havana.
They leveraged the local ties of the Cuban Catholic Church to quietly pass messages.
They provided a secure, neutral, and morally authoritative space. The Pope essentially offered political cover to both sides.
The intelligence gathering told them what each side secretly wanted, and the diplomatic influence provided the how.
It led to the historic 2014 restoration of diplomatic ties, completely circumventing the traditional State Department apparatus.
However, as we look at these massive historical victories, we have to confront the final reflection of Whitmore's analysis.
Right, the digital age.
Exactly. This ancient system was perfected in a world of handwritten letters, quiet conversations in confessionals, and physical diplomacy. How does an institution built entirely on face-to-face human trust survive the digital age?
This is the existential hurdle. The transition from physical to digital is brutal for an ancient bureaucracy.
They're no longer just worrying about a KGB agent intercepting a sealed diplomatic pouch on a train.
No, they have to protect the Curia's internal network from state-sponsored hacking groups in Beijing or Moscow who are constantly probing their servers for diplomatic cables.
They've had to adopt advanced encrypted digital communications while trying to maintain the secrecy of a 2,000-year-old institution.
But it's not just a defensive struggle. They are attempting to weaponize the digital landscape as well.
How so?
The Vatican now utilizes social media and digital discourse as a massive, real-time global listening post.
So they can track ideological shifts, monitor anti-clerical sentiment, or gauge the social temperature of a region instantly, augmenting those slow physical reports from the parish priests.
Exactly. But the logistics of running a digital intelligence network run headfirst into a massive demographic reality. The Curia is old.
Right.
The traditional pipeline for Vatican leadership relies on decades of theological study and slow promotion.
So to defend against cyber warfare, they desperately need to recruit digitally native, highly sophisticated cyber analysts.
But they need analysts who also possess the deep theological and ethical grounding required to operate within the Holy See.
And finding a world-class hacker who also deeply understands Thomistic philosophy is a nearly impossible recruitment profile.
It really is. And through this entire exploration of their capabilities, Whitmore's text consistently dismantles the lazy pop culture myth.
Yes, the Vatican is not a sinister, omnipotent puppet master pulling the strings of world governments from a smoky room.
Right. Their influence is undeniable. It is arguably more pervasive and deeply rooted than any single secular intelligence agency.
But it is an intelligence system based entirely on observation, persuasion, patience, and moral authority. They cannot force a nation to do anything.
They can only map the human terrain and apply pressure to the right philosophical and cultural fault lines. It is influence, not coercion.
It demands a complete reimagining of what global power actually looks like. It proves that human connection can outmaneuver military might.
It absolutely does.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over. We have just spent the last hour exploring a system that relies on the slowest, most patient forms of human relationship. The priest listening to the villagers, the diplomat building trust over 30 years, the archivist guarding centuries of history.
Right.
But look at the trajectory of our current world. We are entering an era dominated by hyperfast artificial intelligence, deepfakes, and algorithmic warfare. Reality itself is being artificially synthesized.
It's a terrifying shift.
Can an intelligence apparatus rooted in slow human empathy and grassroots trust survive this technological tidal wave? Or will the Vatican's absolute reliance on human connection eventually become its fatal vulnerability in a world where you can no longer trust what you see or hear?
That tension between the human and the artificial will definitely be the defining geopolitical test for the Holy See in the 21st century.
To quickly recap the ground we've covered today, we started by entirely redefining intelligence, moving away from the Hollywood model of armies and gadgets to the biological model of the mycelial network, built on presence and influence.
We pulled apart the architecture of the Curia and the Secretariat of State.
We explored the incredible dual network of immune nuncios and grassroots parish priests.
We looked at the brilliant strategic minds of the Jesuits acting as an elite think tank, the awesome defensive power of the secret archives, and finally, how this ancient machinery is struggling to navigate the cyber realities of the digital future.
We've reached the end of this analysis. If this episode added value to your day, please leave a like, share it, and subscribe to Strategic Labs so we can keep deconstructing narratives. Remember to check the video description. See you in the next analysis.